Well, it's 9 o'clock, so we're gonna get started. I hate to interrupt El Gran Combo. And for those who are listening, that is Dr. Will Fulton from the Humanities, Music Performance, and Music Recording Technology areas here at LaGuardia Community College. Dr. Fulton, who I like to call Dr. Funk, turntablist extraordinaire and our resident hip hop specialist. He is also one of the PIs for our Latin American Studies National Endowment for Humanities grant, where some of the dollars for today's event are coming from. We are very grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, for those funds. And by the way, we are also receiving funds through our Division of Student Affairs co-curricular funding, which was acquired for us by another one of our PIs for the grant, Professor Rebecca Talley. And I don't know if people are experiencing, sorry if you're experiencing echo there. I was trying to follow along as a participant on my phone. That should be better. I'm your MC of sorts. My name is Hugo Fernandez. I'm a professor of fine arts appreciation and photography, but I'm also one of the PIs for the NEH grant, and also a co-organizer, as Dr. Talley, Dr. Fulton, all here co-organizing this symposium. And thank you for coming. This was kind of a dream. I'm going to be killing a little bit of time because President Adams, who will be officially welcoming everybody, will be coming in at around 9:10. And just to say a few things. First of all, the symposium is kind of like the culminating event for us for this NEH grant, which started many years ago. First was as an idea of supporting, and hold on, I'm getting texts as well. And to answer you, Dr. Riccio, in a word, no. Dr. Arcario will be joining us at 1:30. But I see that President Adams is here, so I'll be quick with my words. We've been working on this for quite some time. We've had 2 exciting years of activities here with Latin American Studies option seminars with faculty. We wanted to extend it. In our 3rd year, we were going to finish it up, and we found ourselves with some funds that we said, given the pandemic and the situation, we could take advantage of by hosting this virtual conference. And we're grateful to everybody who's participating, making it possible. All of our sister CUNY institutions, colleges, folks will be running the panels and participating. I wanted to say just a quick thanks to some technical support. Dr. Jamie Riccio, who's behind the scenes, who's the director of LaGuardia Web Radio's WLGR radio station. She is the program director, and she's also a faculty member in the Communication Studies program of the Humanities Department here at LaGuardia Community College. And Maritza Acero and Joseph Taveras, who are with us from the Information Technology departments. We could not have done this without IT and Vice President Saltiel and all of his support, everybody there, including Teresa Salginen, and the folks from marketing, Gina Taraskovich, who's also been instrumental in bringing this all together. But I would be remiss to also not thank our president, who has given us the ability to utilize his account here for this webinar. We would not have been able to do this without his support. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce the president of LaGuardia Community College, Kenneth Adams, who will officially welcome you to today's event.
Thank you, Hugo. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kenneth Adams, president of LaGuardia Community College. And I'm pleased to see so many of you joining us today at the CUNY Latin American Latinx Studies Symposium, co-sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Office of Academic Affairs here at LaGuardia Community College. The symposium organizers and I wish to thank our distinguished guests, Professor Alejandro de la Fuente from Harvard University, who will give today's keynote address, and Professor Barbaro Martinez Ruiz, who will join us from the University of Oxford. We welcome Latinx and Latin American Studies scholars from throughout CUNY and from institutions throughout the United States, including a special guest today from the University of Minnesota, the New School, Rutgers, Fordham, UT, Cornell, and Pittsburgh. Now in 2019, LaGuardia Community College served over 30,000 students in pre-college, associate degree, and continuing education programs. Consistent with the diversity of Queens where we're located, 56% of LaGuardia students are born outside of the United States. LaGuardia students come from 158 different countries, representing 81% of the nations on the planet. Now this year, LaGuardia is celebrating our 50th anniversary. And as we do that, we know with pride that LaGuardia is an HSI, a Hispanic serving institution. You know, HSRs are defined as accredited and degree granting public or private nonprofit institutions of higher education with more than 25% or more total undergraduate Hispanic full-time equivalent student enrollment. At LaGuardia, 48% of our students, nearly twice that minimum level, self-identify as Hispanic or Latinx, which, no surprise, mirrors the demography of Queens. According to Excelencia in Education, LaGuardia is the second largest HSI in New York State, following our sister CUNY school over there on Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan, the Borough of Manhattan Community College, MCC. By the way, given New York City's demographics, almost half of the 34 HSIs in New York State are CUNY institutions. We are grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities for their support. It's enabling our LaGuardia faculty to enrich Latin American studies here at LaGuardia. Now, the theme of today's conference is building bridges, probably no more appropriate a theme to as we emerge from the pandemic and need to find new ways to work together with the communities that we serve and address the needs of our students. So many of them challenged by the economic impact of the pandemic. We want to serve our Queens communities and connect our programs with others at CUNY and beyond so that our LaGuardia students can move forward to careers in the fields of their choice or to continue their studies in CUNY or at other colleges, baccalaureate programs, and move on as far as they wish. My appreciation to our CUNY colleagues who will be moderating the three panels today, Professors Jillian Baez from Hunter College, Shelley Eversley from Baruch College, and Raquel Athagai from Bronx Community College. Our NEH award team, LaGuardia professors Hugo Fernandez, who you just heard from, Ana Maria Hernandez, William Fulton, Rebecca Talley, and Joy Sanchez Taylor, have worked incredibly hard to put together this conference today. Finally, I want to acknowledge LaGuardia's Division of Academic Affairs, our Provost Paul Arcario, and Student Affairs for providing technical and financial support for planning this event and pulling it off. And in the end, I have to do this, a very special thank you to the incredible Ana Maria Hernandez, the Director of Latin American Studies and Spanish Translation Programs at LaGuardia, a friend and advisor to me in my first year of my presidency here, and just someone who is so instrumental into the founding and development of our college over many years. As I said earlier, we mark our 50th anniversary this year at LaGuardia. Ana Maria has been here for many of those years. In fact, this September, she'll begin her 37th year of service to LaGuardia. So I just want to close with that note of thanks to Ana Maria for her service to our college, to the students of LaGuardia, and to our faculty and staff, and a big hats off to her for organizing this conference today. Thank you all very much for being with us, and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you very much. And as usual, the president stealing a little bit of my thunder as I was going to introduce the grande dame of Latin American studies here at LaGuardia Community College, Professora Dr. Ana Maria Hernandez, who is not only the coordinator of Latin American Studies option here at the college, she's also coordinator for translation and through the Education and Language Acquisition Department, but I affectionately call her La Condesa. So without further ado, Dr. Ana Maria Hernandez.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenneth, for your very kind words of appreciation, for again, for allowing us to use your webinar. We couldn't have done it without you and the technical assistance of your staff. And also thank you, Hugo, for summarizing the history of our NEH project and over the past 3 years, and also for organizing this culminating event. It was thanks to you, Hugo, who first suggested that we have a final conference. And then in the midst of the pandemic, when we were hesitating, it was Hugo's idea, let's ask for another year so we can organize a Zoom conference. So I must share the limelight with Hugo. I will not call you El Conde, but I do commend you as well as Will Fulton and Rebecca for our teamwork. I would also like to thank Hugo for offering as a banner for our webinar his amazing photograph of the Bacunayagua Bridge, which acts as a visual metaphor for our conference theme of building bridges. At the time of its inauguration in 1959, the Bacunayagua Bridge joined Havana with the then province of Matanzas, which is one of Cuba's most important center of Afro-Cuban culture, therefore mirroring the theme of our conference in more than one way. This visual metaphor also alludes to the theme of the symposium and to the work of our keynote speaker, Professor Alejandro de la Fuente, whom I am proud to introduce. As Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics and a Professor of African and African American Studies, and as the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies, research at Harvard, Professor de la Fuente has helped us recover the history and culture of the people of African descent around the world. His work thus best evidences our goals for bringing together these intimately related disciplines that are often and sometimes siloed: Latin American studies, Latinx studies, Caribbean and African studies, bringing thus to life the voices that have been left out of the historical narrative of the Americas. Before I give the word to Professor de la Fuente, please know that we are having a question and answer session after his keynote address, and please use the QA rather than the chat for your questions. So without further delay, let us welcome Professor Alejandro de la Fuente.
Thank you so much to my dear colleague, Professor Ana Maria Hernandez, for the kind introduction. I should say that I'm not the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. I'm the director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, which is directed by my colleague and friend, Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. I want to thank Ana Maria and Hugo Fernandez and Bill Holton and all the organizers of this event, and President Ken Adams for giving me the opportunity to come back to City University of New York and to LaGuardia. CUNY has been something of a second home for me during most of my academic career. You know, some 20 years ago, now Chancellor Felix Matos Rodriguez, Ana Maria, Ramona Hernandez, Carlos Vargas Ramos, Anthony Acevedo, Lisandro Perez. We were all getting together pretty much every year to talk about our fields, about how to develop Caribbean, Latino, and Latina studies. We didn't use the X then. And Afro-diasporic studies at our own institutions and in academia more generally. We did this for a number of years. It was like a yearly encounter, a yearly event. 20 plus years later, I think we can look back and see how centers that were then embryonic, such as CUNY's Dominican Studies Institute, or that had a longer history, such as the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, have become reference in our academic lives, in our efforts to diversify academia, to create educational opportunities for underrepresented minorities, and to counter the Eurocentric biases and epistemologies that have traditionally informed university curricula in the US and beyond. I see the creation of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard as part of these collective efforts and exchanges. When Ana Maria reached out to me about this conference, she asked me to reflect on the development and the coming of age of a new multidisciplinary academic field of Afro-Latin American studies, and also on the programmatic interventions and initiatives that the Afro-Latin American Research Institute has developed to consolidate and promote this field, which is a field centered on the histories, cultures, and experiences of Africans and people of African descent in Latin America. As you know, the field of African American studies has typically referred almost exclusively to the history and the struggles of African Americans. That is to say, to histories of slavery, race, and mobilization in the United States. If you take a look at Wikipedia's definition of the field, always a good measure of popular knowledge about a given subject, you will read, I quote, that African American studies is an interdisciplinary academic field devoted to the history, to the study of the history, culture, and politics of Black Americans, end of the quote. The problem with that definition, of course, is that it leaves out 95% of the Africans who arrived in the New World between the 16th and 19th centuries, because 95%, over 95% of those Africans went to what is now Latin America and the Caribbean, 2/3 of them to the former colonies of Spain and Portugal. I am frequently asked if the field of Afro-Latin American studies is just a mirror of African American studies, another creation of American academia, and another imposition on Latin America. I always answer that what we have done, and this is something we do all the time, is to appropriate a concept articulated from activism, in this case, from a group of radical anti-racist activists from Sao Paulo. Let me share an image with you. This is a column that was created by these anti-racist activists, radical activists from Sao Paulo in 1977 in the socialist magazine Versus, dedicated to issues of racial and gender justice, issues that in their view were not sufficiently represented in the political agendas of the Brazilian left. Afro-Latin America, and not just Latin America, because it better defines the African presence in this part of the world. The invitation of these activists, men and women who at the time were fighting against the brutal white supremacist Brazilian dictatorship, represents to a large extent the raison d'etre of our field. Our mission is precisely to define better the African presence in this part of the world. It is to rethink Latin America from and through the experiences and contributions of Africans and their descendants. As I always say, es repensar América Latina en clave afro. Just as institutions such as the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños are rooted in the demands of African Americans, Afro-Latinx, and Puerto Rican students and activists who demanded to have their own programs, their own fields, their own spaces, the field of Afro-Latin American Studies and the Afro-Latin American Research Institute are, in fact, the outcomes of struggles for visibility, inclusion, and racial justice in Latin America and in Afro-Latinx communities in the US as well. Writing as recently as 1992, some 30 years ago, Thomas Skidmore, at the time, perhaps the leading scholar of Brazil in the United States, noted that one could, I quote, count on the fingers of one hand the authors who have done serious research on post-abolition race relations, end of the quote. Skidmore was talking specifically about, or was writing specifically about Brazil, but his observations could be applied to Spanish America as well. He noted that throughout Latin America, scholars interested in Afro-descendant peoples had focused almost exclusively on the period of slavery. Again, I quote, as if the topic of race ceased to have any relevance after slavery ended, end of the quote. Now, that panorama has changed dramatically during the last 30 years since Skidmore wrote this. Indeed, if there is something I have learned about this field from the vantage point of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute, is that whenever we create an opportunity, a space, a program, an initiative, even when those opportunities, those spaces, those initiatives are defined in the narrowest academic sense possible, we get flooded by requests and by proposals. Perhaps nothing illustrates this better than one of our academic initiatives, the Meyer Cluster Mammal and Dissertation Workshop on Afro-Latin American Studies. This is a yearly event hosted by the Afro-Latin American Research Institute. The dissertation workshop selects the best doctoral dissertations on Afro-Latin American topics, broadly defined, anywhere in the world, and invites its authors for a two-day meeting, for a two-day workshop at Harvard. Students can submit applications in Spanish, Portuguese, and English, and the workshop itself always takes place in Portuñol. English is actually barely spoken during the discussions. Now, this perhaps gives you an interesting metric about what's happening in the field. This event was created by us in 2016. We have hosted now 5 editions of the Mammal and Dissertation Workshops. The workshop has attracted 893 applicants from all over the world, which means we're talking 893 doctoral dissertation projects on race, justice, and inclusion in Latin America. 893. And of course, there are many people writing dissertations who do not apply to the workshop. The field is literally exploding. It is also changing the face of academia. About 40% of the applicants are people of African descent. What happened? How do we explain this? You know, in some ways, this shift occurred in response to the realization articulated by post-colonial scholars, I'm thinking Alejandro, Walter Vignolo, that race is central to historic and contemporary processes of coloniality in Latin America and the Caribbean. But in my view, the expansion of this field is rooted in the struggles and demands of the Afro-descendant movements in the region, in the efforts of activists, such as those who launched the Afro-Latin America section in Versus in 1977. The field of Afro-Latin American studies has developed in tandem with, and to a large degree, in response to a wave of racially defined social, cultural, and political movements that taking advantage of democratization processes in Latin America since the 1980s have transformed how Latin Americans think about their region, about their cultures, about their history. These movements have challenged traditional discourses of race and nation that depict Latin America as racially egalitarian and harmonious, what we now frequently refer to as ideologies of racial democracy. They have also demanded legislation. They have demanded specific policies to address discrimination and inequality. And their efforts have produced significant results, starting with the Nicaraguan constitutional reform of 1987, which recognized the existence of minority communities on the Caribbean coast, legal instruments that ban discrimination and acknowledge the multiracial character of Latin American societies have proliferated. In 1988, the Brazilian Constitution banned discrimination and recognized the rights of former runaway communities, the so-called quilombos, to their ancestral lands. Other countries, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, followed suit and now recognize collective rights for the population, their populations of African descent, while others, Argentina, Cuba, Panama, Uruguay, explicitly condemn discrimination because of race in their constitutional texts. More recently, in 2018, Mexico and Chile took steps towards the legal recognition of Afro-descendant minorities in their countries, in the case of Mexico, at the constitutional level. Activists also targeted the national censuses and demanded the inclusion of ethno-racial categories to counter the traditional invisibility of these groups in their own countries. In the 1980s, only 2 countries in Latin America collected information concerning individuals of African descent, Brazil and Cuba. By the 2010s, Afro-descendants were counted in 17 countries in the region, as Mara Loftman has shown in her excellent book, National Colors. Mexico, by the way, joined the group with the census of 2020, where they counted people of African descent for the first time. That census was conducted at the very beginning of the pandemic last year. The history of this movement, of these efforts, had a moment of singular importance, and of singular importance to the field in December 2000, when more than 1,700 activists and government representatives from all over the Americas convened in Santiago de Chile to attend the Regional Conference of the Americas, the preparatory conference for the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that would take place a year later at Durban in South Africa, you know, the famous World Conference of 2001. The Santiago Conference was a landmark event. On the one hand, the sheer number of participating activists, the widespread participation of activists and community leaders illustrated how much the movement for civil rights and racial justice had advanced in Latin America since the collapse of most authoritarian regimes in the late 70s and 1980s. On the other hand, the event marked for the first time the public acknowledgement by state authorities that racism is a major problem in the region, demanding serious policy responses. As the conference's concluding declaration stated, I quote, "Ignoring the existence of discrimination and racism at both the state and the societal level contributes directly and indirectly to perpetuating the practices of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance," end of the quote. Racism and discrimination were characterized as historical products of conquest, colonization, slavery, but at the same time, the declaration noted that the effects of these processes persisted and are in present tense, not as something from the past, but in contemporary societies. I quote, "a source of systematic discrimination that still affects large sectors of the population," end of the quote. These are state authorities speaking about racism in our societies. In order to combat the effects of racism, discrimination, and racial injustice in the region, The conference approved an ambitious plan of action. This plan had deep implications for the field of Afro-Latin American studies. For several of its measures were linked to the production and dissemination of knowledge concerning people of African descent in the region. The plan urged states to compile and disseminate statistical data on people of African descent, something that, as I mentioned before, is already happening. This information would serve as the basis for programs of inclusion and access to basic social services and economic opportunities, including policies of affirmative action. Some of the items in the plan concern education in fairly concrete ways. The parties agreed to the need to create educational and research programs about Africa and about Africans and their contributions to history and civilization, especially in the Americas, as well as to disseminate information against racial stereotype and racist myths. The plan asked states to include the study of racism in university curricula and to organize courses on racism and discrimination for public employees, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, and members of the judiciary. Attention was also given to the media, to its role in disseminating racial images and information, and to the need to ensure a representation of people of African descent in the media in every country. This plan called, in short, for the field of Afro-Latin American studies. Now, scholars such as Agustin Laomontes and Alejandro Campos have shown one of the key contributions of the Santiago Conference is that it sanctioned and normalized the category of Afrodescendientes, of Afrodescendants, as a group with legal, cultural, and ethical implications in the arenas of international justice and human rights. It was at Santiago, as Afro-Uruguayan activist and diplomat and dear friend Romero Rodriguez famously stated, that activists came in as Black but left as Afrodescendants. Entramos negros, salimos afrodescendientes. The conference also helped to consolidate and make visible a transnational network of race justice activists that was able to exercise pressure, sometimes considerable pressure, on national governments for the adoption of specific policies against racism and against discrimination. As part of these efforts, activists not only deployed knowledge produced by scholars, but they produced, systematized, and disseminated important new knowledge concerning their communities and their own areas of action. As activists formulated demands in the areas of healthcare, education, environmental justice, job training, gender violence, poverty eradication, police brutality, among many others, they were compelled to gather and produce valuable information concerning Afrodescendants and their cultures and living conditions across the region. On top of that, the movement itself has become a subject of intense study, prompting numerous studies about race and mobilization in contemporary Latin America. These movements, these struggles, have been the main engine propelling this field. No wonder then, the very first major initiative of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute was precisely to engage with activists from the Afro-descendant movement all over Latin America and to consult with them. In 2015 and 2016, we organized 2 symposia. I did this with the collaboration of my colleagues Silvia Valero and Alejandro Campos at Harvard and at the Universidad de Cartagena. The first symposium was titled Afro-Descendants, 15 Years After Santiago, Achievements and Challenges. And the second, After Santiago 2000, the Afro-Descendant Movement and Afro-Latin American Studies. The meetings were attended by activists who have been, people who were historic leaders of the movement, who have been, many of them had participated in that foundational conference in Santiago de Chile. They came from Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Venezuela, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Cuba. and included well-known figures such as the late Celeo Alvarez, who appears on your screen to the lower right, a dear friend of the Institute, which I personally miss very much, as well as people like Epsi Campbell, currently Vice President of Costa Rica, who is in the picture above, with Romero Rodriguez and Chucho Garcia. Also there were Quince Duncan, Edna Santos, Pastor Murillo, and many others. They came together to reflect on the achievements and shortcomings of that plan of action that had been approved in the year 2000, that had been generated at the Santiago Conference, and to help us assess the state of Afro-Latin American studies. That is, to reflect on how academia could contribute to their struggles. This symposium reignited all networks of activists, fostered new conversations among different actors involved in race justice initiatives in Latin America, and most importantly to us, helped define our research and teaching agendas. Or to put it differently, we organized these events to learn from activists. I always say, halfway jokingly, that when we organized these events, I had to tell my colleagues something that is very hard to tell scholars, which is to shut up and to listen. Activists are knowledge producers, and the whole point is to find ways to bring that knowledge into our classrooms and into our research agenda. Since then, the Afro-Latin American Research Institute has also organized country-specific meetings to consult with activists from the Afro-descendant movements of Cuba, Colombia, and Brazil. As you can see, the Brazil meeting took place in April 2018. One of our guests for that meeting was Afro-Brazilian intellectual, activist, and feminist Marielle Franco, who was assassinated just a few weeks before our event on March 14 in the streets of Rio de Janeiro. We kept Marielle in the program and refused to let her go. We ended up actually dedicating the whole conference to her. This symposium, these consultations with activists produced several concrete results on the academic end. First, activists, policymakers, and agency representatives, people who participated in these forums, argued that since they could not follow the abundant scholarly production on Afro-descendants, it would be useful to have a book assessing the current state of the field of Afro-Latin American studies. In response to that need, several of the scholars participating in these exchanges decided to produce the volume requested by our collaborators. And the result is a volume, Afro-Latin American Studies and Introduction, that I co-edited with George Reed Andrews, University of Pittsburgh, and that was published in English by Cambridge University Press. But the most important part, I think, is that the book also came out in Spanish and Portuguese at the same time. It was published by Claxo, and it's open format in Spanish and Portuguese. So it can be easily used by anyone who wants to have a quick window into what has been happening in this field. We also took the additional step of creating a specialized book series, Afro-Latin America, which is also published by Cambridge University Press. If you look at some of the titles we have published, you can see that they range geographically from Cuba to Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. They also range chronologically from the colonial period, Larissa Garcia book, or the 19th century, in the case of Yesenia Barragan's forthcoming volume, and Yuko Miki's book, to the 20th century, which Mexico, Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti. To give you another metric about what's happening in the field, since we created this series in 2016, we have received close to 50 book proposals for it. Second, participants in these forums, in this symposia that I mentioned before, discussed the difficulties involved in accessing information about the Afro-descendant movement, about its organizations and and initiatives, as well as about government programs concerning racial justice in the region. There are numerous projects, initiatives, actions taking place locally all over Latin America, and researching that is incredibly difficult. So in response, we, in cooperation with the Gender and Diversity Division of the Inter-American Development Bank, launched in 2018 a monthly newsletter or bulletin that compiles this information. The bulletin is produced by the Afro-Latin American Research Institute, and it's basically populated by information that is sent to us from the communities by NGOs, Afro-descendant organizations, cultural centers from all over the region. The bulletin newsletter is circulated widely through our own social media. You can check it out. You can check the whole series in our website, and also through the Somos Afro platform of the Inter-American Development Bank. So this is now a resource that is available to researchers, to students, to donors, government officials. It's a way to provide visibility and access to local initiatives that frequently have gone unnoticed and that were very difficult to research for us. Third, the activists with whom we consulted asked us to do something else. They asked us to develop pedagogic platforms that were accessible to them, to their communities, to ordinary people across Latin America. Now, this is, of course, a huge challenge because our institutions are poorly prepared and are generally unsympathetic to efforts of this sort. Our answer to this has been our Certificado de Estudios Afro-Latinoamericanos, an ambitious program of online courses on race and inequality in Latin America that are open to students and individuals from the whole region. All the courses are taught in Spanish and or Portuguese. The certificate is a pedagogical, transnational, and anti-racist platform aimed at democratizing knowledge production and dissemination in Afro-Latin American studies. As of now, 66 faculty from 9 different countries and research groups in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Spain, and the US participate in this platform. Those 66 faculty offer a total of 9 courses, an introductory course, and 8 elective seminars. 60% of the faculty involved in this effort are women, and 41 self-identify as people of African descent. And to give you a sense, I mentioned that whenever we created an opportunity, we got flooded. To give you a sense of what's happening, of the kind of demand that surrounds intellectual production in this field. Our first 2 cohorts, we launched this in 2019, so before the pandemic. We started these online courses before the pandemic struck, which was somewhat lucky for us because when all this health crisis began, I had developed some basic literacy about these online platforms, about which I knew nothing before. Our first 2 cohorts, 2018 and 2020, attracted 357 students from all countries in Latin America. All of them are represented except Bolivia. The largest groups, of course, came, as you can see there, from Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, but also there are numerous students from Argentina, Peru, and other countries. The countries of Central America and the Caribbean, including Cuba, were also represented. More than half of those students self-identify as people of African descent, which again tells us something about the sort of demand, the pent-up demand that exists in the region for this kind of knowledge. And 2/3 of them self-identify as women. The occupational profile of the participants includes, as you can see, strong representations of students, teachers, activists, government officials, and representatives of NGOs, of non-governmental organizations. I think the high participation of K-12 teachers is particularly promising, given their ability to produce knowledge in their own classrooms across Latin America. The participants share a virtual space in which they study the evolution of racial inequality in Latin America and develop skills to identify, analyze, and combat racist practices and racist ideologies from different perspectives. The discussion forums are particularly rich. I think that's the best part of all these courses, because participants come from a variety of countries and experiences and fields of action. So that sort of networks that are produced through these courses are themselves a very interesting development. As Afro-Colombian activist and scholar John Anton Sanchez states, the certificate is, I quote, a seed that will germinate for the benefit of more than 180 million children of the African diaspora who cry out for reparative justice against the damages caused by centuries of slavery. End of the quote. I think, however, that our field's depth to activism goes well beyond these initiatives, these interventions, these lessons. The Afro-descendant activism has also liberated the field from its very tight links to the US, has moved the field out of the thick shadows of American sociological understandings of race and of American paradigms of racism and inequality. By the time Skidmore wrote the observations I mentioned before in the early 90s, studies of slavery and race in Latin America had developed largely in conversation with and as a mirror of studies of race and slavery in the United States. This is not an original argument. Several scholars of race in Latin America have acknowledged that, as anthropologist Peter Waite states, studies of race in the US are the explicit or implicit benchmark of racial studies in Latin America. US racism was a sometimes unacknowledged but powerful and omnipresent elephant in the room. The room itself had been created by American scholars in the mid-20th century, thinking of people like Frank Tannenbaum, Stanley Elkins, Gunnar Myrdal, and others. What was common to all these scholars is that when they looked to Latin America, they did so in a search for answers about the so-called American race problem, answers to what Myrdal famously called the American dilemma. This was, in fact, an exercise in introspection. Latin America was just a space to understand the United States. It was not really a space to be investigated or researched on its own. The Afro-descendant movement demolished those epistemological walls, prompting new questions, infusing urgency in the production of knowledge about previously ignored issues, periods, areas, and problems, demanding new research agendas that connect with contemporary struggles for racial justice and inclusion. It is happening also everywhere across the entire region, not only in a spatial sense from Chile to Mexico, but also in terms of the sites of knowledge production, which is happening in multiple locations, including communities, cultural associations, civil rights organizations, international organizations, government agencies, in addition, of course, to schools and universities, which is our own field of action. Let me give you a sense of what's happening in the field thematically and from the point of view of the disciplines by going back to our dissertation workshop, which in a sense gives you a preview of what is to come. These are the scholars, practitioners, and professionals of tomorrow. These are people who are in the process of writing dissertations. Bear in mind that this is knowledge being produced at the highest levels of academia across not only the Americas, but beyond. And as you can see, it is coming from every conceivable discipline to a point in which we sometimes have a hard time, as you can see in the other category, categorizing some of this production within the traditional disciplinary background. In its report, Afro-Descendants in Latin America, published in 2018, issued in 2018 by the World Bank, they know that to achieve equity and the social inclusions of Afro-descendants, I quote, the region must first understand and visualize their needs and agendas, reversing decades of policy and analytic neglect. End of the quote. This is precisely what the field of Afro-Latin American studies does, to reverse decades, if not centuries, of neglect. So our challenge now is the proliferation of programs. It's to promote new programs, new departments, new courses, to train scholars, to create publications, teaching courses, and outreach sources that support Afro-Latin American studies in Latin America, in the United States, and beyond. Some of this is happening already, as illustrated by the new Afro-Diasporic and Racial Studies program at the Universidad de Puerto Rico. I was elated, delighted to learn about that initiative, or the master's degree, the Maestría en Estudios Afrocolombianos, launched by the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá, a program that I was honored to attend the launch of that program a couple of years ago. The Seminario de Estudios Afro-Mexicanos and the Diplomado that is sponsored by the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico. The activities of the CEAF, of the Centro de Estudios Afro-Diaspóricos at Universidad ICESI in Cali, Colombia, or the jornadas and the activities of the GEALA, the Grupo de Estudios Afro-Latinoamericanos at Universidad de Buenos Aires. So there is now a growing number of programs, initiatives that are also from academia pushing this field forward, but we have much more to do. And our work is really just beginning. We need to create academic spaces and programs that junior scholars and students, particularly of African descent, can call their own. That is how we transform education in Latin America. That is how we rethink America Latina en clave Afro. We need to create from academia spaces, opportunities to nurture junior scholars and activists who are out there producing knowledge, working with their communities and sometimes from their communities, moving the field forward from their own locations. So let me finish with one of those voices to illustrate how the field is being enriched, is being propelled from the communities by new generations of scholars, many of them of African descent, who are asking new questions, writing new histories, recovering traditions and pasados, right, that were unknown to us. I want to refer to the work of Jesiani Ambrosio Nazario Perez, a doctoral student at the Universidad Federal de Rio de Janeiro, who writes and researches from her own community, the Comunidad Quilombola de Caveira, San Pedro Aldea in the Rio de Janeiro region. The community received official recognition as a Quilombola settlement by the Palmares Foundation in 1999, but it hasn't received titles to their lands yet, as these processes are, as you can imagine, frequently contested. In this context, research like that produced by Jesiani is key to the future of that community, of her community, a future that very much depends on the reconstruction of new histories of those communities, of their struggles and traditions. Furthermore, these communities are themselves sites of knowledge production that enrich the field. There is an elementary school in that community, the Quilombola Municipal School, Doña Rosa Geralda da Silveira, which is named after a local union leader, a female leader, Afro-descendant leader, whose struggles are now part of the curriculum in that school. This is how new histories are written. This is how the field is growing. Jesiani wrote a moving text in the Geledes portal, the famous Afro-Brazilian women's organization, in which she basically thanked us for the opportunity to attend our 2018 workshop. She basically, I'm sure you can read it, but she says, I went to Harvard conscious and sure about what my participation represented. I took with me a flag of the Quilombola movement in Brazil, CONAC, which was registered in the official picture of the event. I received excellent critiques about my work, which will for sure help me to make it better. I register here my gratitude to this initiative of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute for inviting Black women and Quilombolas intellectuals information to such a prestigious academic space, causing internal revolutions that transcend us, as is the case with other Quilombolas around me, who are now motivated to fight and to valorize their struggles by the mere fact that my work was selected to participate in this event. When Jessiani was notified that her work had been selected, she sent this beautiful picture from her community, a small Quilombola community, thanking us for listening, ouvirnos historia, for listening to their history. But of course, we are the ones saying thanks here. We are the ones who are grateful for the opportunity to connect with these new and exciting generations of scholars, for the opportunity to insert stories and figures such as Rosa Geralda da Silveira into our classrooms. I, of course, did not know who Rosa Geralda da Silveira was until I read Jessiani's work. John Anton Sanchez has referred to the Afro-Latin American Research Institute, to the field, and to some of our activities as a seed. But the true semilla, the true seed here, was provided by Afro-descendant activists. It was planted by them. We are just farmers tending to fields that they created and made possible. And with that, I am going to now stop, and I assume that my dear colleague Ana Maria Hernandez will tell us what to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro, for your very inspiring and very informative session. I am now asking attendees to please post their questions in the Q&A. There were 2 questions already. I believe Hugo is going to address the question by Iris Lopez. Iris Lopez asked if the conference is being recorded. Yes, it is, and how and when it will be available, because she wants to share it with her students. Hugo, are you?
Actually, Dr. Riccio, who's our webmaster, is recording this to the cloud, and afterwards, I mean, she might be able to answer that. She's going to have a getaway weekend, so she will probably not have it immediately, but hopefully, Dr. Riccio, would you say within a week or so?
Yes, so I would say in about a week, this will be made available. We'll have a link for you so that you can access it via YouTube and some other means as well. So.
And we apologize if we're running a little early. We're going contra Latino here, where we started a little earlier. So if some folks who tuned in at 9:30 to hear Dr. Velafuente's remarks kind of came in the middle of it, but again, we will have the recording available, most likely in 2 parts, since we will not be recording the film that will be playing during lunch.
Thank you, Hugo. We also have a question from Devon Brooks, who is an Afro descendant from Puerto Rico, and he wants to know how he can find out about these activities, these opportunities, about working with communities. Alejandro, is there a link, or is there any way that he can find out about these activities?
Sure. I mean, it's actually now fairly easy to connect with many of these things, Devon. If you simply go to, just do a search, Afro-Latin American Research Institute, or go to alari.edu, you will immediately find. And once you get, I always say that once you get in the Alari family, it's like a Latin American family. There is no way to leave. It's once you get into our world, you will basically receive information about all this. If you are interested in the activities of the Afro-Descendant movement in the region, the place to look is this bulletin that we have created and that we disseminate with the Gender and Diversity Division of the Inter-American Development Bank, because you will find it really has become a very good archive of initiatives that are otherwise very difficult to research. So if you're interested in that, well, just send us an email and we'll reply and we'll try to help you. We'll try to guide you to the right resources.
Thank you, Alejandro. Are there any other questions?
There's a couple of hands up, Anna Maria, Norca Blackman Richards and Rosalia Reyes. We are encouraging you to use the Q&A line because we can't turn the mics on for attendees.
Yes, and we cannot monitor more than one at the time. But we have a question from Kiana Neal. Can art history coincide with Latino Americano studies? I want to major in both and want to know if they could work well.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question, Kiana. And the answer is an enthusiastic and unqualified yes. If I could, let me see if I can show you very quickly one initiative that I'm going to share one more time my screen here. I hope you can see that. Can you see it, Ana Maria? Is it?
Yes, Getty Foundation. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this is a program, Kiana, about the development of Afro-Latin American art. This is one area where we think we need to do a lot of work in Latin America and the Caribbean, and as well as in Latinx communities in the United States. As you probably know, African American art exists as a field. It has its own courses, it has its own books. There are collections in museums. Museums have, in fact, in the last few years, sort of been rushing to increase African American representation in their collections and in their activities. But Latin America is well behind in this area, and we are trying to promote the study of Afro-Latin American art as a field of study in academia across the region. That initiative that I showed there, which is an initiative that we do in collaboration with the Getty Foundation, is geared towards that goal. Please feel free to reach out to us if you are interested in this. There is a ton of work to be done in this area. I have witnessed those dissertations that I mentioned before. I have witnessed how production on that field is growing. So there is something of a wave happening, but as everything in this field, we need to find ways to channel all that energy in productive ways. And there is, there are sometimes rather basic things that need to be done. And I'll mention one to you that I reference frequently. If you go to some museums in Latin America and you stand in front of an artwork produced by an artist of African descent, there is nothing in the information concerning that piece of art that would let you know that you are in front of the work produced by an Afro-descendant master. So students go to these museums, school children are taken to these museums, they're shown the museums, but they never learn that sometimes the work they're seeing, the work they're studying, the work they're enjoying was produced by artists of African descent. So we need to call attention to these things in order to use art as a platform, not to develop this field, and also as a platform for struggles for racial justice and inclusion in the region.
We have a question from our distinguished colleague, Milga Morales Nadal, an important figure in Puerto Rican studies. And her question is, how is Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican diaspora represented thus far in the research focus on Afro-descendants?
It's, Puerto Rico is one of those areas that, it's one of those areas that should get more attention, that where additional intellectual and academic production is needed. And this new program at the Universidad de Puerto Rico, and I've been in touch with them for some time, this Afro-Diasporic and Racial Studies program that was funded by Mellon Foundation recently, I think it's going to be transformative. I think it's going because the key here is to create spaces, academic, intellectual, institutional spaces. Once you create that, people will come. The people are out there, they're interested, they want to do this kind of work. It connects with their lives, it connects with their communities, it connects with their struggles. So when we have a program like this at the Universidad de Puerto Rico, I think we will see in a few years how that intellectual production will increase. But so far, I have to say that that in my sense is that intellectual production is not still at the level in which it should be. I mean that there is a lot to be done on Puerto Rico.
We have a question from Alejandro Toro, and besides O Colombo dos Palmares, is there any other specific episode on Afro-Latin American history that you would absolutely recommend to take a closer look on?
Oof. Is there another? Oh my goodness. Yes. I would, look, I think, let me put it this way. What's the name again of the person who asked the question?
Alejandro Toro.
Alejandro.
Yes.
Alejandro, so it's a tocayo. Alejandro, let me say that if you are interested in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, in the culture of Latin America and the Caribbean, if you are interested in the region, there is no way to understand Latin America. There is no way to even think Latin America and the Caribbean without Africans and Afro-descendants. This is not a minor contribution here. This is many of our societies were African societies for a long period of time. And Africans arrived in the Caribbean from the 16th century to the 19th century. The first slave society in the Americas was developed in the Caribbean, in what is today the Dominican Republic, in Hispaniola. One of the last slave societies in the Americas was Cuba, where abolition did not happen until 1886. Africans arrived in the Americas in places like Cuba and Brazil through the mid to late 19th century, through the 1850s or the 1860s. So Africa is not a root, it's not a raíz, it's not a reference. Africa is who we are. So it's very hard to answer your questions because my instinct is to tell you, just simply go. And whenever you study almost any historical process in Latin America, chances are that when you study those processes, the Afro-descendant presence is not going to be prominently referenced. But if you look hard, you will immediately encounter that presence. You will immediately encounter Africans and people of African descent. You want an example? When we all travel to places like Mexico or Lima, we admire some of the monuments of the Spanish Baroque, right? The cathedrals. And we see those monuments, we see those buildings as examples of European civilization. But those buildings were built by Africans in many cases by enslaved Africans. So in which sense are those buildings not related to the African and Afro-descendant experience in Latin America? Is there a way we can look beyond and capture the contributions and the subjectivities and the ethical considerations that went into the production of those buildings? Can we? I think we can, but we have to develop new questions, new methodologies, new ways of approaching and seeing these things in order to repensar America Latina in clave Afro, as I said before.
Alejandro, we have two related questions, one very specific, one more general, both from CUNY faculty regarding CUNY. So I'm going to pose both of them together because I think one can lead to the other. The first is from Norca Blackman Richards, and she says, the pairing of Afro-Latino studies is not readily presented CUNY-wide. What do you recommend to assist in the promotion or inclusion of Afro-Latin American studies as a discipline, even as a minor across CUNY? And the second question comes from Patricia Matthews, the chair of Ethnic and Race Studies at Borough of Manhattan Community College. And she says, as you mentioned, the work of country-specific needs is important and also one that crosses all these boundaries. I am wondering of alliances of movements that link Afro-descendants with indigenous groups that continue to be most marginalized, especially in countries where they are a majority. For instance, the Andean countries. How much are they working together to overcome these subordinations?
Two excellent questions. Let me start with the first one. One of the things that, and I'm sure you all as faculty at CUNY have better ideas than me about how to do this, but I can at least reference to what has been done in other places and how it has worked in other places. I think the first step is always to create a space, is to just issue a call and say who would be interested in participating in this, in an initiative like this. And I think you'll be surprised how many faculty and students would be interested and can contribute something from their own disciplines, from their own areas of study, from their own periods, from their own countries of study, to that common enterprise. In places like North Carolina, for instance, there is something of they call it a consortium, a university consortium, where scholars from different UNC Charlotte and other schools around are collaborating in creating curricula, in creating courses, and in sharing information. So that's how they've done it. So instead of doing it to just the interior of an institution, they have pulled resources from various institutions. Now, CUNY is so big, and is what it is in New York City, that I don't think you need help from any outside institution. I think you have more than enough to, especially because CUNY also has this constellation of resources, which I mentioned before, the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, the Dominican Studies Institute, all of which can be excellent platforms to develop this kind. But the first step is to have a conversation. The first step is to say, well, this is happening. This field is moving forward. How can we help from our space? And I think a space like CUNY can be absolutely crucial in this process. I sort of placed the very creation of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute in a history that, I see the Afro-Latin American Research Institute as part of that chronology of centers like the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños or the Dominican Studies Institute. So in developments within the Latinx field of study, I don't see the creation of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute within the sort of Cold War logic that presided over the development of Latin American studies in the United States as a field after the 1960s. I see it more linked to these other struggles, to these other academic efforts, such as those that took place at CUNY. So I think if you if you issue a call for faculty and students who are interested in this thing, my guess is that you'll be surprised about how many people would be interested. And that would include, by the way, and this connects with the second question, would include people who are interested on the indigenous front, because one of the most interesting cutting edge kind of areas within Afro-Latin American studies is Afro-Indigenous relations. Peter Wade was right. He wrote, I don't know, 20 plus years ago when he questioned the intellectual logic of telling the histories of people of African descent and indigenous peoples as separate histories. Even from different disciplines, indigenous peoples are studied by anthropologists and people of African descent are studied by sociologists. And he issued a call for the need to integrate them into shared analytical frames. Well, the scholarship on that front has also increased dramatically in the last 20 plus years. Not as much as other areas in Afro-Latin American studies, but this is kind of a small booming sub area within the field. And that reflects instances of collaboration in activism as well. And I'll give you an example. The recognition of people of African descent in the Colombian Constitution in the early 1990s was in fact advocated by indigenous people. People of African descent were not at the Constitutional Convention. So there are many instances of cooperation and of cross-pollination. There are also instances of conflict. But if we look, I think it would not be impossible to articulate an argument similar to the argument I articulated today about the Afro-descendant movement in general. I think it would be possible to do something similar by looking at moments and examples of cooperation between Afro-descendant organizations and indigenous organizations. And there is, I asked Peter Wade to, Reed Anderson and we asked Peter Wade to write the chapter on Afro-Indigenous scholarship for that volume on Afro-Latin American studies, and he produced a wonderful essay, which would be a useful place to start, learning about what's happening in that area.
We have a number of questions, they keep coming. And before I go on to the next question, I would just like to stress two reactions from Oilda Martinez and from filmmaker Pamela Sporn, whose film we will be showing during the lunch break, about how impressive your statement that Africa is not a root, it is not a raíz, it is who we are. I myself, it brought goosebumps. It is so so obvious and yet so powerful. And I will go on to a question from Fidel Tavares, History Department at Queen's College. The history of Afro-descendants in Latin America is undoubtedly a growing field, deservedly so. While this is a welcome development, are there any potential pitfalls? For instance, do you think that the emphasis on studying maroon politics and various forms of resistance to the exclusion of many other topics have the unintended result of exoticizing Latin America as a region beset by revolutionary upheaval?
It's a great question. It's the sort of question that a historian would ask, my kind of crowd. It's a great question, Fidel, because of course, I think you are absolutely correct in inviting us to think about, what's the other side of the coin, right? How made this look differently, and what are some of the unintended consequences of all this production. My reaction to your good question would be something like this. I think I would be personally happy to deal with that problem. If the problem is that the production is so large that we have to, that it produces this kind of unintended effects, okay, So absolutely, let's deal with that problem. Because what we have had so far is that, Latin America is already exoticized as a place of constant political instability and in total chaos. Historically, that's, as you know, is like a long-standing stereotype about our political history, and we have that, and we also have it with the invisibility of Afro-descendants and their struggles. The Afro-descendant movement communities, like Jessiani's community, they need their own pasts. They need their own histories. Those histories have not been written. Those histories need to be written, and the movement is demanding this knowledge. Is demanding the production and systematization of this knowledge. Is demanding that young scholars like Jessiani, what they're doing in a sense is recovering these local traditions, these local stories, these local struggles, these local figures like let me say the name, like Rosa Geralda da Silveira, so that the volume of that production, I think, will in fact move the needle about how we think about the political history of Latin America and about struggles for freedom and democracy and inclusion in Latin America. I always tell my students that we are in fact approaching a moment in which we are beginning to be ready, and I kind of smell this, and I wish I had enough life to see it happen, in which we are moving from the history of Black freedom to a Black history of freedom, which is not exactly the same. We are getting close to a moment in which we can begin to reconstruct the political history of Latin America, not only through the struggles of people of African descent, but through the visions, the intellectual visions and projects of people of African descent, which sometimes did not map out very well with liberal notions of citizenship and the nation state. But it's a great question, and I think your invitation for us to think about pitfalls, about limitations is a very healthy and necessary invitation. Thank you for that.
Our next question is from Beto O'Byrne, one of our faculty members at LaGuardia from the Humanities Department in the area of Performing Arts, and his question deals with the performing arts. Do you have any specific example of how Afro-Latin American cultural practices in performance? For example, are there significant Afro-Latin American playwrights, choreographers, plays, dance troupes, etc.? If not specific individuals, are the cultural performance practices that we can point to a significant contribution to performance aesthetics?
Yes, there are, Beto. Yes, there are. And there is some scholarship about this. You may want to check, for instance, there is a book that Juana Maria Ordonez Cook is a book dedicated to basically to Afro-descendant theater and to Afro-descendant playwrights. It's a book that was published, a number of years ago. You can check it out. There are also, within this part of this kind of subfield of Afro-Latin American art, there are a number of scholars working on, junior scholars working on Black performance. The University of Chicago-based group on slavery and visual culture has paid some attention to this. And I don't remember, I should, but I don't remember her name on top of my head, but there is a junior scholar there who's working on these issues. You may want to check it out. There is also a wonderful dissertation, forthcoming book in the making that Maya Berry has written about Afro-Cuban performance and how those performances connect with and interact with Afro-Cuban struggles for inclusion. And when I say inclusion, I don't mean just in the metaphorical sense. I also mean in the sense of participating, of creating opportunities to participate in the new dollar economy and in the new tourist economy of Cuba. If you look at ethnographies like Jafari Allen's work on sexuality and performance in Cuba, you also will find references to this. So there is a small, it's not a huge body of scholarship, but I think you'll find, if you take the time to look, you'll find a dozen interesting references about this out there.
By the way, just a 5-minute warning if
Yes.
this is verbal.
We are running out of time. Maybe we can take one more question from John Gutierrez. John Gutierrez wants to ask you about your observation that the work of Tannenbaum, etc., was very much about introspection about the issue of race in the United States. He's wondering if you believe that Latin America still occupies this space for North American intellectuals. In other words, are North Americans interested in writing a work like Slave and Citizen with all of the usual caveats that apply to that book?
Okay. Thank you, John, for that. This is another historian question. I think that some of the concerns that propelled people like Frank Tannenbaum and Stanley Elkins in the mid-20th century to look at Latin America are still there. I mean, we're still trying to understand, tensions and histories of racial stratification in the U.S. We deal with questions of racialized violence in the U.S. every day. We deal with structural racism in the U.S. every day. But I think there is a fundamental difference. First, people of Tannenbaum's generation could think of Latin America and what they called Anglo-Saxon America as two sort of sealed units of analysis that they could put side by side, and they would go from the Anglo-Saxon to the Latin in order to learn about themselves. No scholar today would even think about these units as sealed and separate units. I mean, there is so much scholarship about cross-pollination, about the transnational nature of the production of racial ideologies, that vision would not survive in any of our classrooms for 5 minutes. I mean, a student would raise his or her hand. I would say, "What are you talking about?" And then on the other hand, and this is where the movement comes in. You see, the movement generates, Afro-descendant mobilization has generated questions that have nothing to do with the United States. These are truly genuine Latin American questions that have to do with Latin American own histories of racial stratification, slavery, mobilization, nation making. And by generating these needs, by generating these, by pushing scholars and academia to pay attention to these issues, the movement has done, as I said, an enormous service to the field, because it has basically taken the field out of those shadows, out of the shadows of the U.S. gaze, which was, Tannenbaum was trying really to understand, mid-20th century, is trying to understand what on earth is wrong with the United States when it comes to race relations. I think scholars, US-based scholars who now study Latin America may still have some of that, but they are now trained and they now read and a scholarship that comes from a different trajectory, and that's now large enough to move the field in a different direction. So So I truly believe that there is a qualitative difference here, and that difference owes, as I said before, owes a great deal to Afro-descendant mobilization in the region.
I thank you, Alejandro, for your very moving and informative keynote address, and thank you for all participants for their very fascinating questions. I wish we had more time, but we already got 15 more minutes from you, Alejandro, because we started early. So we are happy that you were able to stay with us for another 15 minutes to address these questions. Thank you again, Alejandro, and all participants for the most productive session.
Thank you, Ana Maria, again, and thank you all, Hugo, for the opportunity to be here, and to all the questions. I have to say, I cannot even take really credit for the presentation, in the sense that Ana Maria told me what to do. You know, she told me what I needed to do.
Yes, we're used to that.
So, you are too kind. You are too kind, Alejandro.
Yes.
That's why they call me La Condesa.
Yes.
So I basically tried to do that. Okay. It's always good to be with you. Un abrazo.
Always good to be with you, Alejandro.